Good morning. You're all very welcome to this, our third day of the 2021 Autistica Festival. And this morning, we're going to be having our second keynote session, which is called Neurodiversifying Autism Intervention Research and Practice. So this keynote is presented by four people who share a keen interest in neurodiversity and in early autism intervention. And through their informal discussions, they shared their thinking and their diverse experiences about neurodiversity and intervention science. And that led to them writing an excellent paper, which has been published in Frontiers in Psychology. And we'll share a link to that paper in the chat, and we really do recommend you have a look at that. It's also not behind a paywall, so you don't need to be at a university or institution to be able to read it. And that's the basis of what today's keynote is going to be about. So the keynote is by Kathy Leadbitter, who's a research fellow at the University of Manchester. Her research interests are in developing and evaluating autism interventions for UK NHS context, and also in low and middle income countries. It's also from Leneh, who's a researcher and consultant who often serves as a translator between autistic experts by experience and neurotypical researchers. And she speaks the languages of both these communities, so is uniquely placed to be a translator between those. She's currently undertaking a PhD at the University of Manchester, looking at autistic people's difficulties starting activities, which is called inertia, and has just had the first peer-reviewed paper on the subject published. So again, we recommend you have a look at that. Ceri Ellis is a research associate at the University of Manchester with experience of working on pragmatic research trials and aims to improve the lives of neurodivergent people and their families. Her research interests include language and communication, health, well-being, and social advocacy. And Martijn Dekker is a 47-year-old autistic father of three. And in 1996, he set up the first entirely self-hosted online autistic community on the internet, witnessing the neurodiversity movement in its very infancy. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over to Martijn, who's going to kick off the talk for us today. And just as a final reminder, please do submit your questions right the way throughout in the Q&A function, and we'll get to those at the Q&A section at the end. So Martijn, over to you.
Good morning and welcome, and thank you, Lorcan, for that great introduction. So this talk presents the main points from our paper on neurodiversifying autism early intervention research and practice. And in our paper, we want to answer the following question: how can we apply the neurodiversity paradigm to early intervention research so that such research actually serves the interest of the autistic people it is supposed to help? But first, a content warning. In outlining existing early intervention and behavior modification practice, this talk mentions forced normalization, aversives, torture, and suicide. So please keep yourself safe if you need to. This talk is recorded, as mentioned, and you'll be able to watch it at a moment if you're choosing in a couple of weeks. Next slide, please. First, I will give a brief overview of the history and the basics of the neurodiversity paradigm. Kathy will then talk about how we should modify the targets of intervention, after which Leneh will discuss how this should influence best practice. Last, but far from least, Ceri will then draw some conclusions on how all this should inform future research. Next slide, please. So, first, an overview of the history. Long before neurodiversity, in the 1940s, Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger first described autism, and they did this in terms of case studies, which is basically a form of narrative. And of course, they each got to shape their own narratives. But the perspective of autistic people, the subjects being studied, was completely absent from these narratives. To make matters worse, parents of autistic children were demonized early on. Psychoanalysts blamed cold, distant refrigerator mothers for their children's autism, a narrative that endured for decades. As a reaction, parents started autism organizations to support each other. Then behaviorism came along. Applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, seemed to show promise for the autistic children that the psychoanalysts had written off as hopeless. But if a child failed to be cured, parents were still blamed for not working at it hard enough. So they subjected their children to more and more extreme and harsh therapy regimes at an ever earlier age, in the hope of saving their children before autism could snatch them. APA became a lucrative business whose practitioners were only too happy to provide. Thus, parental trauma and desperation are what actually begat the notion of early intervention, which is not a good start. Next slide, please. So it took the internet for autistic people to finally be empowered to insert their voice into these conversations. The early text-based internet not only overcame the fact that we were geographically and systematically isolated from each other, but also eliminated autistic difficulties with body language and other problems with face-to-face communication. There was no social media then. Starting a group of any description was difficult and generally required the support of a large organization. In 1992, parents of autistic children started the first online autism forum, the St. John's University Autism mailing list. Parents validated each other's experiences and viewpoints, supporting each other in trying to make their autistic children as normal as possible. But then something interesting happened. One after another, autistic people started showing up in this community. This did not go very well. The parents mostly used autistic participants as resources, or self-narrating zoo exhibits, to borrow a term from Jim Sinclair, and they considered communication between autistics to be an annoying waste of bandwidth. Autistic members quickly started questioning and opposing the parents' ideas of an ideal treatment outcome. They basically said, we don't really want to be normal like you. Autism is a way of being that can be beautiful. We just want help with the problems and barriers we face. Here is how we would have liked to be helped. Here are some ideas from an inside perspective on how to give your children a happy life. But most parents were dismissive. They thought that these internet people who claimed to be autistic were nothing like their children. Now, parents of autistic children previously blamed for their children's autism were already traumatized and entrenched and on the defensive. At the same time, autistic people had a lifelong traumatic experience of being treated as less than human, etc. So we had the perfect conditions for igniting a conflict that continues to this day. Next slide, please. Fed up with being patronized, Jim Sinclair and others then started the first autistic-run organization called Autism Network International. As of 1994, it ran its own university-supported discussion mailing list, the ANI list, ANIL. This was the first online autistic space. Like in other communities in the disability rights movement, the people with the disability in question are in charge. For autism, this was new and radical. The community also invited what they called cousins, people with autism-like conditions or autistic-like experiences. ANI's inclusive term autistics and cousins, or ACs, foreshadowed the neurodiversity paradigm. In 1996, ANI organized Autreat, the first conference for and by autistics. It took the idea of autistic space to the three-dimensional realm, aka real life, and changed many lives for the better. Next slide, please. Then in 1996, I entered the scene. I was newly diagnosed autistic at the age of 22 after spending my childhood and early adulthood being different, but having no idea why. By that time, I had a decade of experience as a computer programmer, which empowered me to set up my own lit server on my own computer run over dial-up. So between 1996 and 2012-ish, I ran a set of mailing lists called Independent Living on the Autistic Spectrum, or INLV for short, one that became my community and defined the rest of my life. Some of its members came up with ideas that proved influential. For instance, the Australian sociologist Judy Singer and the American journalist Harvey Bloom jointly coined the term neurodiversity. Around 1998, developments on the internet finally made it easier for almost anyone to start their own group. First, there were public commercial list servers where anyone could start their own discussion list. Then websites with forums appeared, some of which became very big, like Wrong Planet, founded in 2004. Social media finally turned everything on its head, but I'll spare you that rant. In 2007 and 2009, a couple of very nasty campaigns received global attention. The Ransom Notes campaign in 2007, run by the New York University Child Study Center, and the I Am Autism advertisement from 2009 by Autism Speaks. Both of these portrayed autism and other neurodivergent conditions as monsters that kidnap normal children and hold them ransom. These attempts to further prey on parental desperation caused the neurodiversity movement to be further galvanized, along with an unending series of scandals of mistreatment in institutions, exemplified by the routine use of remote-controlled electric shock devices at the Judge Rotenberg Center in Massachusetts, something that the United Nations condemned as torture, yet continues to this day. So, this concludes a very brief overview of how the neurodiversity movement came about. It's all because autistic people met on the internet. To read more about its history, I highly recommend this open access book, Autistic Community and the Neurodiversity Movement, Stories from the Frontline, edited by Stephen Kapp. It has chapters on all the points I could only touch on very briefly here, and a lot more as well. Next slide, please. Now, before I hand off to Kathy, here's a brief overview of the basic tenets of the neurodiversity paradigm. First of all, it's an aspect of biodiversity. Brains vary, as does everything else that is biological, and this variation can be beneficial and is in fact essential to the survival of species. Thus, neurodiversity is a natural and valuable form of human diversity. Neurological difference is not necessarily pathological. But the word necessarily is necessary here because not all neurological difference is good. Some neurological conditions are not even compatible with life. However, with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, etc., some abilities are enhanced as a result of the very same characteristics that can also be disabling. In other words, the good and the bad are often inseparable. Taking myself as an example, the same autistic feature that makes it difficult for me to engage in neurotypical social chit-chat also enhances my ability to be honest and truthful. The same autistic feature that makes me get mentally stuck a lot, unable to start an activity or stop one that I've already started, also makes it possible to dive more deeply into an area of interest than almost anyone else, without losing concentration or getting bored. If embraced, autistic features are a real source of potential. But this does not deny the reality of disability. The social model of disability states that disability results not only from impairments inherent to the person, but also from society's failure to adapt for these impairments. So the notion of disability includes both those who feel primarily disabled by inherent impairments and those who feel primarily disabled by society's failure to include them because they are different. Either way, though, rights and power inequalities play into this. Autistic people and neurodivergent people in general are a minority in society that frequently suffers from being systematically disadvantaged and discriminated against. So the neurodiversity movement falls squarely within the disability rights movement. In summary, the neurodiversity paradigm is the radical notion that humans who are different are human and entitled to the same human rights as anyone else. And now I'll hand off to Kathy Leadbitter, who will tell you what all this means for better targeting of early intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Martijn. So I would like to take the neurodiversity framework as outlined by Martijn and start to think about the implications of that framework for early autism intervention practice. And I would argue that this is something that all autism intervention researchers and practitioners need to do. And indeed, many are doing this. For a long time, the field has focused on effectiveness with little consideration of other key dimensions. And of course, effectiveness is critically important. No one wants to spend precious resources on interventions that don't work. However, there are also other key dimensions which haven't been given nearly as much attention, such as what our interventions target and how they target it. Next slide, thank you. So what should our autism interventions for children be trying to do? Well, let's start off with what they should not be trying to do. The first implication of neurodiversity for early intervention is that we must move away completely from a curative or normalization agenda. Talk of curing autism is no longer acceptable in many intervention contexts. However, a normalisation agenda is still implicit within discourse around interventions, including that around prodromal interventions, biomedical research, and behavioural interventions. It can be seen in talk about preventing autism, treating autism, or closing the gap, which refers to wanting the development of a group of autistic children to look more like that of a group of neurotypical children, as shown in the graph here. And I think this implicit narrative can filter down into parenting and education more generally. And the spoken or unspoken goal becomes to make an autistic child like or more like a neurotypical child. And coming on to the next slide, this is problematic on several levels. So on a conceptual level, there's no evidence that it's even possible to cure someone of what is an innate neurological difference. On an existential level, if someone's autism was removed from them, this would have a huge impact on their identity and personhood, and would essentially be tantamount to making them into a completely different person. And this is something that most people wouldn't want. On an ethical level, explicit or implicit normalisation agendas lead to increased masking, whereby autistic people try to hide their autistic characteristics and appear more neurotypical. And research is increasingly starting to show that masking can come at a huge cost to mental health and well-being. Normalisation also stigmatises autism and autistic ways of being as being other or less, and this stigma also impacts upon mental health and well-being. So there are clear important reasons for us to be very careful to move away from normalisation agendas. And as practitioners or researchers, we need to be on the lookout for when these agendas, however subtle, start to come into our ways of thinking and talking about the purposes of our interventions. It's important to emphasise that none of this means that interventions for autistic children are not important. This does not mean that supporting and promoting the development and learning of autistic children is not important. As interventionists, educators and parents, we should absolutely take seriously ensuring equality of opportunity and access for autistic children to learn, develop and communicate to their full potential. But this must not mean and does not need to mean that we measure success by how, like neurotypical, our autistic children have become. Success can be measured in lots of other ways. But this does bring challenges to the field in terms of standardised measurement and outcomes. And Ceri's going to talk more about this in just a moment. So now I'm going to come on to talk about intervention targets that are more consistent with a neurodiversity perspective. As described by Martijn, neurodiversity emphasises that all brains are different, but that the world has been built around the needs of a predominant neurotype. And this causes problems for those with a more minority kind of neurotype. An important early focus of our interventions is to think about the environment around the child and the goodness of fit between a child and their environment. And not just the physical and sensory environment, although we know that these are very important in autism, but also the social and emotional environment around the child. When autistic people are asked what they would like to be changed, it's often that they want other people to be more understanding and accepting. And this is a sentiment that's also shared by many parents, as demonstrated by this quote from Adam here, who says that he wants the world to be more accepting of his son, and that would make life easier for his son. Autism research has traditionally taken an individual deficit medical model approach. This is the context within which our interventions and research methods have been developed. And we need to interact with the legacy of this. But we are increasingly seeing a move away from this and towards the adoption of a social model or a social ecological perspective. This is something that Robert Chapman has spoken brilliantly about at previous Autistica conferences. This model emphasises that, yes, of course, someone's impairments can impact upon their well-being, but so does a poor fit between a person and their environment, and when there's inadequate accommodation of a person's needs. Literature on resilience, such as that by Michael Ungar and colleagues at the Resilience Research Centre in Canada, has actually shown that systemic factors such as family, school and community can impact upon individual outcomes more than individual traits, skills or deficits. So consistent with the neurodiversity framework then are interventions that attempt to make aspects of the environment a better fit for an individual child. And when we think about the environment of young children, we think of families, homes and educational settings. And we have several groups around the UK working on interventions that aim to do this. So coming on to the next slide, we can see a few examples, and this is not in any way an exhaustive list. So Solace is a programme that's been developed by Chris Papadopoulos and Anne-Marie Lodder and colleagues at the University of Bedfordshire. And it's designed to support parents of autistic children to cope with the stigma they may face and prevent the internalisation of stigma. Reach ASD is a project run by our team at the University of Manchester, which evaluates an intervention to support parents of newly diagnosed children to better understand autism and feel okay about life and being a parent to their child. And I'm going to be talking more about this in the panel this afternoon at 2 o'clock. LEANS, or Learning About Neurodiversity at School, is a project run by Alyssa Alcorn and Sue Fletcher-Watson at the University of Edinburgh, which aims to produce resources that help school staff and school children to understand neurodiversity with a view to increasing inclusion and respect in schools. And I believe that Sue's going to be speaking about this research in the panel this afternoon too. So there are some really nice UK examples of teams attempting to develop and test interventions which target the environment around the child. Coming on to the next slide. What other things should our autism interventions address? A neurodiversity perspective mandates that neutral characteristics of autism that do not cause bother be left alone, but that interventions should be there to address characteristics that do cause distress or discomfort to the individual. Historically, many interventions have focused on behaviour, what autistic children do that looks unusual or impacts upon other people. And Leneh is going to talk more about behaviour in just a moment. There's been much less emphasis within autism research on internal experiences and the well-being of autistic children. So not just what looks unusual or causes bother to other people, but what is causing discomfort or distress to the autistic child themselves. And flipping that over, what is helping the autistic child feel happy and well. A focus on internal experiences is not always that simple, as we cannot always easily ascertain the views of young children or those who do not use symbolic communication. We need more research into the childhood factors that are associated with long-term well-being, and this will enable us to boost these important factors through early intervention. This is also a good reason why active listening to and collaboration with the autistic community is so important. And what do autistic people tell us that they want to be changed? As Martijn said, the term "fix our problems, not us" sums up the sentiments of many. And the problems described in research or in lots of other forums are things that lead to poor well-being and quality of life. Things like anxiety, sensory overload, inertia, loneliness and social isolation. These are just a few things that people talk about. And again, to highlight some good examples of research going on around the UK, Autistica is funding projects that aim to understand anxiety in young autistic children and work out how best to support them with that anxiety. Senator is a trial run by Rachel McNamara and colleagues at Cardiff University, which evaluates sensory integration therapy delivered by occupational therapists to address sensory regulation needs in autistic children. Next slide. But life is not just about avoiding the bad. Our aim should not just be to develop interventions to remove the aspects of life that cause discomfort and distress, to bring people to neutral or to the yellow part of this dial. We want our autistic children to be happy and to thrive. We want this dial here to be on green. The adoption of a positive psychology and strength-based stance refocuses intervention efforts away from reducing deficits and towards enhancing those activities or skills that naturally lead to learning, social connection and well-being. There is very little research that focuses on interventions that aim to do this, that aim to promote enjoyment, relaxation and skill. How can we as adults support our children with this? There is emergent evidence that interests and passions can bring pleasure and relaxation through repetition or intensity of immersion in tasks, behaviours or objects. Predictable access to preferred activities can also provide opportunities for skill development and expertise and lead to genuine social connection with like-minded people. Spectrum Gaming is just one example of an organisation that tries to do this by bringing autistic children together through gaming, something that many autistic children and children generally enjoy. Further research could look at what the benefits of such activities are. Also important to well-being is a positive identity and self-esteem. And our interventions should support children at the right time to understand their own diagnosis and what this means for their identity in a constructive, positive and realistic way. Parents also need support with how to talk to their child about autism. The Pegasus programme, developed and evaluated by Kate Gordon and colleagues at Great Ormond Street in London, is one example of an intervention that aims to do this. Communication is also intimately linked to well-being. Interventions supporting communication with and around the child that recognise that communication is a two-way street are therefore really important. Paediatric autism communication therapy has been developed and tested by our group in Manchester, along with many other UK collaborators, and is a well-evidenced intervention that supports parents to understand and respond more sensitively to their child's communication and interactional style. I'm now going to hand over to Leneh, who will expand upon these and other points.
Thank you, Kathy. Kathy's talked about some interventions that are usually good, such as changing the physical environment to better accommodate the person's needs or adjusting the social environment by supporting parents. There are also some approaches that are consistently not good. These include what Martijn mentioned, aversives. It is generally a bad idea to torture people, even if they are autistic. This can be obvious things like electric shocks, but it can also be more subtle, like spraying them with water or deliberately aggravating sensory issues. And another is poison. Now, this may seem obvious, but apparently it isn't to those feeding their autistic children bleach. Then there are some intervention methods that are more ambiguous. Using an autistic person's interest to engage them with learning is fine, but controlling access to their interest as a reward or punishment is more questionable. Next slide. Dealing with difficult behavior and using behavioral principles to do that is a normal part of parenting. For example, not giving a tantruming child an ice cream. However, compliance training, which is often a part of structured behavioral interventions, can interfere with ability to express distress. Ignoring attempts to communicate teaches an autistic child that trying to communicate is pointless and that they don't have a right to refuse the imposition of adults. Keep in mind what you want in an adult. Someone who has a lot of aggressive or self-harm behavior may find themselves in a very restricted situation. A compliant person is easier to care for, but they're also more vulnerable to abuse. In order to cultivate an adult who is resistant to maltreatment, we must not teach children to be unquestionably compliant. Those who are naturally passive need to be taught to act out and stand up for themselves. All of them need education in rights and personal boundaries. So when you're looking to solve a behavior problem, the key question is why? And some of the most common answers are stress, distress, and frustration. To solve these, rather than trying to eliminate difficult behavior, reduce stress and improve communication. A sensory-driven behavior needs to be replaced with something more desirable that meets the same need. For example, giving someone a perfume sample card to smell instead of random women's hair. Another under-recognized issue is that many autistic people have difficulty acting when and how they want to. This is the subject of my research, so if you're interested, look for my poster in this conference and my newly published paper on autistic inertia. In brief, it is common for autistic people to be unable to act on their intentions despite being motivated and technically able to do the task. Next slide. As we heard about on Monday afternoon in this conference, many autistic people are lonely. One approach to this is to deliberately teach social skills. Trained social skills can be very useful for scripted encounters like one might have in a shop, and for emergency situations like encounters with police. Where social skills training does not work so well is in facilitating the formation of genuine relationships. In the late 1990s, in one of these chat rooms that Martijn said, talked about in the early autism community, I knew a young man, I'll call him Oliver. He'd been given ABA therapy as a child, and he always sang its praises and credited it with growing up to be so able. When he came into the chat room, if someone asked how he was, he'd say, just fine. And if no one asked how he was, he'd say, just fine, all the same. He continued to say he was just fine every day, even when we heard from Oliver's mother that he'd had a breakdown and had failed out of university. In all the years I knew him, Oliver was never able to get beyond his trained social script to a genuine social connection, even with other autistic people. Strategies that can be more flexible are things like supporting the autistic child to problem solve their own responses to a social situation. There is a world of difference between providing a toolkit of possibilities that can be used when needed and training an autistic person to carry out unnatural behaviors and essentially attempt to pass as a non-autistic person full-time. Being mentally healthy requires having a positive identity, not spending your whole life thinking you are so wrong and broken that you need to pretend to be someone else. Developing genuine social connections based on shared interests, shared experiences, and compatible communication, such as autistic people have with each other, is essential. The key question when deciding on social skills interventions is what will help the person to meet their functional interaction needs, to get help or interact with the community, and what will help them to make genuine connections with others. Next slide. As one of the speakers in yesterday's panel, whose name I didn't write down, said, autonomy is about being able to make decisions and have them implemented rather than doing everything yourself. I am exercising my autonomy more effectively when I have support workers do household tasks so that I can save my limited initiative reserves for things that are important to me, like my research. Supporting autonomy means teaching decision-making and respecting decisions, even if they are unwise. If a child never gets to make decisions in low-risk situations, they will not learn to make good decisions at all. Autonomy is key to a good quality of life, prevention of abuse, and reduction of distress. Communication is essential for meaningful autonomy and social connection. A neurodiversity-informed approach to communication means accepting, cultivating, and accommodating diverse communication styles and methods. It means working with, not against, autistic communication strategies such as echolalia, scripting, and hyperlexia. It means abandoning the idea that communication equals speech. My son can talk for England now, but using signs as a toddler allowed his language to develop when his perfectionism wouldn't allow him to speak until he could do it right. Beginning with Damien Milton's double empathy problem, and now supported by research evidence, it is clear that the difficulties of social communication are not a matter of autistic people being wrong or broken, but about incompatibility between autistic and NT styles. autistic communication can be superior when it comes to getting genuine social information. For instance, how does an NT find out how long their friend will be staying? An autistic person can just ask another, when are you leaving? Without any subtext about being unwelcome. I have a specific point to make about internet access. If an autistic child is on the internet at all hours, it may be tempting to remove access. As Martijn discussed, it was no accident that the neurodiversity movement began on the internet. There are many advantages to text-based communication for autistic people. Taking away access to this communication is like taking away a wheelchair. And I have permission to share a short story to illustrate this, but warning, it mentions suicide. So following a bad transition to high school and a lot of bullying, one of my children, who is normally very cheerful, became depressed and reclusive. They spent a lot of time on the internet at all hours. I was encouraged to block the internet at night, but never did, because I recognized its importance from my own life. One night at 3 a.m., the police came to my door. They were there because my 12-year-old had used the internet to tell Childline that they had repeatedly tried to end their life and would try again. I feel rather vindicated for not restricting the access to their means of communication, and they are now a thriving, happy young adult. Next slide. There are a few principles that can guide you in determining if an intervention is good. As Kathy said, don't fix things that are harmlessly weird. Eliminating behaviors won't lead to sustained improvement unless you consider the underlying need the behavior is meeting. Put aside assumptions that all people are fundamentally similar. Autistic people may differ in unexpected ways. Rethink ideas like everyone wants friends, or that actions and motivations are intrinsically linked. Is the last thing that happened the cause or just the last straw? Are there sensory elements of this situation you might be overlooking? Are they choosing not to comply or willing but stuck? Remember that autistic children are children and they have a right to freedom and to play and to choose their own activities. Ask yourself, would this be okay to do to a non-disabled child? It is better to improve the environmental goodness of fit before resorting to changing the autistic person themselves. If there is a question of whether to spend energy on independence or autonomy, focus on autonomy. Next slide. So while you may need interventions in order to cope day to day and to help an autistic child to cope, develop, learn, and enjoy life, also keep in mind the long-term goals are to make an adult who is able to live with minimal restriction, who is mentally healthy, and is resistant to maltreatment. Intervention should support to aim these through teaching strategic non-compliance, supporting decision-making, learning to behave in ways that do not lead to settings that restrict freedom, being able to express needs, developing a positive autistic identity, and an understanding of their place in the world. And now I'll hand the floor to Ceri, who will discuss application of these principles to early intervention research.
Thank you. So, as researchers, it's vital for us to listen to developments in our field so we can develop better research practices that will improve the quality and impact of our work. And this obviously applies to when we're working within the neurodiversity framework. So reflecting on our values and listening to those affected by our research is vital so that we can continue to develop and improve our research practices. So what's clear from what has been presented today already is that there is an essential need to listen to autistic people and what their priorities are for what should lead the research narrative. So how then might how will this be relevant for the development of early autism interventions? Well, it hasn't been clear-cut so far. Research has recently shone a light on problematic practices that have taken place in the field, and in particular has focused on how early autism interventions are developed. The rate of conflicts of interest among some researchers involved in early autism interventions are unfortunately high. There are examples of when researchers who test the effectiveness of their interventions have been also involved in the development of them. There is a culture of sort of pressure to publish studies that are shown to be effective, which researchers benefiting from career advancements and the increased likelihood of future grant funding. Another conflict is that some researchers may benefit financially from their interventions or affiliations with commercial developers who market their interventions or measures that they have developed. However, what's important for the future is that research is conducted in a transparent and open way so that we can understand some of these conflicts and interpret how this may affect the outputs of some large-scale research trials. But how then should we go about framing the effectiveness of interventions? Well, we need to look at effectiveness through the lens of outcomes that are most important to the long-term well-being and autonomy of the children involved in research and the preferences and priorities of autistic people. Research can then evaluate the extent to which these prioritised outcomes are or are not improved by any particular intervention. While an intervention may be effective at reducing autistic behaviour, well, if it leaves the child without coping mechanisms or risks their mental health, it clearly hasn't been effective in improving their life. And these are the outcomes that matter. So coming on now to outcome measurements. So tools used to measure early intervention outcomes are often focused on the reduction of autism symptoms with a focus on deficits. And this links in with what was earlier said by Kathy about the normalisation agenda. So if children's autistic behaviours are reduced sufficiently, they will no longer meet the criteria for autism on these outcomes. So in practice, measures that focus on autism symptomatology, such as the ADOS, which is widely used as a primary outcome, focuses on a mishmash of different aspects of language and behaviour, with a focus on deficits and a sort of collection of neurotypical targets with things such as eye contact, echolalia, and the social appropriateness of behaviours. Many of these target variables, of course, are incompatible with the neurodiversity framework, such as imposing non-autistic social behaviours or reducing sensory behaviours or motor movements that act as coping strategies. However, as also mentioned earlier, others are consistent with it, such as improving communication. So as researchers, we can move away from these measurement tools to instead focus on producing validated tools that assess the goodness of fit between an individual and their social, emotional, and physical environment. And there are some good examples already available, which I'll mention now, such as the Autism 5-minute speech sample that measures the emotional climate around the autistic child. There's the dyadic communication measure for autism that assesses caregiver communicative synchrony with their child. We also need robust and creative ways to measure in which children, all levels of communication ability, specific and transparent intervention outcomes that are variably beneficial, including autonomy, quality of life, and variables that easily impact on these, such as functional communication, inertia, and anxiety, which we've talked about today. Some measures that we can adapt are such as those that are already used in clinical contexts, such as the ICF core set for autism. What these outcomes produce are clinical global impressions, which are importantly individualised for the person and provide meaningful outcomes for research. So what we can do to kind of improve the landscape is develop better partnerships with autistic people. And of course, as we've already mentioned, parents have historically been the focus of meaningful involvement within early intervention research, which did contribute to much of the conflict that Martijn described earlier in the talk. So we do need to move away from this model. There's a need to better understand and create new ways to involve autistic children and adults who have communication impairments also. And recently there has been a shift in viewpoints and priorities. In the UK, there is now an increased understanding among researchers and funding bodies of community priorities, such as those highlighted by the James Lind Alliance. And a call for more meaningful involvement of autistic people in research, which I will come on to mention next. Also, more neurodivergent and autistic people are leading academic discourse, and there is a greater emphasis on participatory and action research models with autistic viewpoints and experiences at the heart of the work. These developments have cast light on the need for autism researchers to realign their priorities and rethink some of the ways in which they work, thereby slowly changing the emphasis and tone of research. So some research groups have championed for autistic participation and autistic-led studies. And I've highlighted some examples of different research groups here, which I think will be linked in the chat as well. But what have we learned so far? So we know that autistic people have essential knowledge, experience and skills, which is not always found among those without lived experience. And crucially, experts by experience are more than their experience, and they're experts themselves in myriad fields. We've learned that autistic people are particularly invested in research outcomes as it directly influences their community. And this is always important to bear in mind. We've also highlighted barriers to research participation, and language can be changed and adapted to be accessible to all. Although there are sometimes barriers to accessing autistic viewpoints on the outset of studies due to things like funding. So it's always better to remember that it's better to involve people at the end of a study once it's possible to reimburse people for the work they do rather than not at all. Autistic people also understand reflexivity and thinking about your position in relation to the work you are doing, which is an important part of the research process. The fostering of trust and communication between individuals with shared experience is also vital, which is invaluable for creating a safe space for sharing perspectives. I've been lucky to work with Autism at Manchester, led by Emma Gowan, which has helped me better understand what is particularly bothersome for autistic people and how we as researchers can do better. So now just to turn towards the future. And in conclusion, what is fundamentally important for us to do? We need to set the needs, preferences and priorities of autistic children and people at the heart of our research. We need to reflect on wrongdoings and move beyond historical barriers and misunderstandings and value the expertise and lived experience of autistic people and the acceptance of individual neurotype. With close attention to the needs, preferences and priorities of autistic people, we can move beyond historical divides, misunderstandings, to a place we can value the expertise of autistic people and embrace practices that respect and accept individual neurotypes and ensure our interventions address the things that matter most to recipients. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that absolutely excellent presentation. Really, really interesting. Lots to think about. Already getting some really good and interesting questions in. So just a reminder to people, we do have a few minutes for questions, so do submit more via the Q&A if you have some, but also throughout the day, if you kind of go away and have a think about it and reflect on it and have some other thoughts, do use the hashtag on Twitter to share those thoughts. So I'm just going to jump straight in and start asking some questions. So the first one we have is from Laura Coffey, who said, Leneh, I loved your presentation so much. I worry that this information isn't getting out to neurotypical parents of autistic children. Are there any education programs or resources that specifically target this group to help them better understand their neurodivergent children and interpret their behavior?
That one had my name in it, so I guess I'll start. But actually, Kathy has a more thorough answer, because I would refer you to the program that they're piloting, Reach ASD, which I've been involved with. So it's got my stamp on it. But there's that it has a good balanced approach to post-diagnostic parent education that includes understanding why autistic children behave the way they do. Do you have anything else?
Thank you for the plug, Leneh. Yeah. And like I say, I'm going to be talking more about this at 2 o'clock this afternoon with my colleague Louisa. So we've been trying to develop a programme, as Leneh says, which tries to do 2 things really. So it tries to give some really high quality information to parents about autism that's kind of, we hope, is up to date and takes a real neurodiversity and kind of autism positive perspective and slant. And also tries to, it gives more traditional information about autism, but also gives lots of autistic perspectives as well about how they perceive the world, their way of being and so on. And on top of that, it also tries to provide parents with time and space to reflect upon their own thoughts and feelings about getting the diagnosis for their child and what that means for them and what that means for their child going into the future. We've had some really good feedback. We're doing a big trial to see whether it's effective. So we don't know how effective it is yet. That's a work in progress. But I suppose that is one example of one intervention that might, if it proves to be effective, address the sorts of things that the participant is asking about. There are other interventions as well. I think Pegasus is another good example that's been developed at Great Ormond Street, which I think is aimed at parents of older children and runs parallel sessions with parents and then with the young people themselves. And again, really tries to provide a supportive environment to think about autism and to do so in a kind of very positive and constructive way, but also a balanced way, so that parents and also children can reflect upon some of the challenges that come with being autistic as well as the obvious strengths and positives that we've talked about today.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is from David Henderson, who said, again, an excellent set of briefings, and thank you for that. So David said you focused a great deal on early intervention here, but can you tell us a little bit about what you think research can learn from late diagnosed autistic folk? So for example, David says he is now 70 and was diagnosed 3 years ago, so has had a full life full of experience. And often these kinds of research, when they do engage members of the public, it's often parents. So is there something, a role for autistic people and specifically late diagnosed autistic people who didn't maybe receive autism specific services when they were young? Kathy, do you want to have a first attempt at that one?
Yeah, I'll have a try at that one and then open it out. I mean, obviously, so my research focuses on early interventions, so interventions for children. But as we said in the talk, I think absolutely we can and must learn from autistic adults, whether they were diagnosed as children or whether they were diagnosed as adults, and whatever age they were diagnosed at, because those autistic adults know what it's like to be an autistic child. And often that's a really important insight for us developing interventions either for parents or that directly work with autistic children, so that we can have insights into what that autistic child's experience is, which, as I said earlier, is sometimes difficult for us as researchers or practitioners or parents to really get a good insight if those children are very young, or if they're not using symbolic communication, they're non-speaking, or they're not able to articulate what their experience is in a way that we can kind of access. So I would absolutely argue that is really important, and I suppose as well it also helps to inform us about the importance of early diagnosis and early support for young people as well, because if people haven't had that, sometimes their life can prove to be very difficult.
Brilliant, thank you. So does anyone else want to come in on that one?
I'm just typing a response.
Sure. So just to say, apologies, we're running a few minutes over, so we are going to stay on for another couple of minutes just so that we have time for questions, but we understand if people need to sign off. But again, this is all recorded and will be available afterwards if you do need to catch up. So I'm getting lots of comments from people rather than questions saying, this has been fantastic, I've loved the presentation, let the speakers know that this has been revolutionary. So those comments are all coming through. The next question is from Stephen Carson, who says, I struggle with the term intervention specifically. So we now have these autistically informed interventions, but I wonder if the whole concept of intervention or the word itself has been irreparably tainted by previous and still sometimes current toxic intervention strategies. So the question is, do any of the panelists here have some views about whether the word intervention can be saved or whether actually we need a broader conversation about that?
Does anyone else want to speak to that? I'm happy to speak to it, but I want to give other people the opportunity to speak as well. No, okay. Well, go on, Martijn.
Yeah, I agree that the word intervention has been tainted very much, especially in circles of autistic people, right? And particularly autistic activists, and you know, with very good reason, given practice so far, which has been, you know, mostly abusive or worse. However, in order to actually reach the people we want to reach and convince the people we want to convince, I think we have to speak their language and use the word that they are using, at least for now, so that we, you know, so that we can get them to listen to us. So it's, I think that is a strategic choice that perhaps we should be making, at least for the moment. Does anyone else have anything to add about that?
I would agree, Martijn, and I totally agree with the point that the participants made as well, that the word intervention, I do struggle with, because it's like, you know, we're intervening with autism, it's an autism intervention, let's intervene with this autism thing, which is really, as we've explained, not at all the approach that we should be taking. And, you know, we are, as Martin says, left with a legacy of you know, all the researchers and the intervention developers who have come before us. And we need to some extent, work within that. And we also need to, as Martin says, convince our funders and our commissioners within the NHS or whoever it is that this is a valid thing to support. And a word like intervention, I think, can be helpful in that. But I wish there was another word. I prefer the word intervention to treatment, certainly. But I think if you were to call it a support system or something like that, that just wouldn't have enough oomph to convince people that this is something that's worthy of backing or funding or whatever. So yeah, but I agree that it's not the ideal word, and maybe we can, as a field, think of a better word.
Perfect, thanks for that. So the next question comes from Heta Pukki, who says, what are your views on developing and using medications? So can that ever be compatible with the neurodiversity view that's been suggested here? For example, if the outcome measures that are selected are ones that people are interested in changing.
Yeah, again, a really good question. And one that's quite complex, I think. And I think, you know, we can apply the same principles as what we've spoken about today, you know, more focused around psychosocial interventions, around, you know, why would we be using a medication? And there are, you know, trials of interventions going on around the world, trials of medication, going on around the world, which test medications to reduce autism symptoms or to improve social reciprocity, or, you know, lots of other kind of targets. And obviously we can have a think about whether some of those targets are consistent with the neurodiversity framework or not, and I would suggest that some of them probably aren't. On the other hand, if the medication is being used to address something that we know is causing distress or discomfort to the individual, and it is affecting their quality of life and well-being, then I would perhaps suggest then that may be a worthy thing to explore within research. I don't know if my co-presenters have anything to add to that. They're looking blankly. I think they're happy with my response.
I think that was a good answer. I think that was a really good answer to a difficult question.
Brilliant, thank you. So the next question comes from Teresa, who has asked, can any of the approaches, or do you have any advice to encourage mainstream environments that at the moment do value compliance above all else, often because of the large numbers of children that they have to work with?
Again, yeah, really, really important issue. And, you know, obviously when thinking about young children and children generally, you know, schools are critically important. And we know that the school environment can really impact upon children's mental health, well-being, quality of life, and so on. So I do completely agree that we need more research that looks at schools and the ethos that schools are adopting. And I mentioned before a project that's being run by University of Edinburgh, which is trying to create resources that schools can use to learn more about neurodiversity and to promote more of a kind of neurodiversity framework within classrooms. And I think that's a brilliant piece of work. We need more like that. I think schools are very variable. I do have some experience of working within schools and lots of family members who work within schools, including with autistic children. And schools are very variable in the extent to which that they're understanding and accepting of neurodiversity and neurodivergent children, and the extent to which they are flexible in their curriculum or in their kind of routines or classroom kind of processes to accommodate differences. Some schools do that really well, other schools less so. And I think, you know, maybe Ceri can talk more about this, because Ceri's done a piece of work looking at school ecologies and looking at the differences between schools in what they think their priorities are, in terms of, you know, what is school there to do, and therefore what should teachers and classroom assistants, what should their priorities be for individual children, for example. Do you want to speak more about that, Ceri?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting and important topic, and I completely agree with all the points that you've highlighted there. And just to sort of echo the same sort of sense that I also get from your experience, that what's interesting about the sort of organisational culture of schools more broadly is quite often it's just down to the individual, or you might have a Senko at a particular school who really drives the kind of education for the colleagues around neurodiversity and kind of drives good practice as well. So yeah, just very variable, I think, and unfortunately a bit of kind of luck of the draw really for people, which is really not helpful for kind of the people's experience.
All right, perfect. I'll ask one more question. So apologies to all those whose questions we didn't get to. I would love to stay here for longer and get through all of them, because this is really, really interesting. But the last question that we have is from Nick Chown, who spoke about the graph that Kathy presented with autistic scores on a red line and neurotypical scores on a blue line, which I think was hypothetical data to illustrate the point. But the question that Nick is saying is, if that graph were to be presenting something that was an autistic strength, perhaps the pattern would be the other way around, and you would see the autistic line above the neurotypical line. And perhaps when we talk about closing the gap in the first graph, what we might unintentionally end up doing is closing the gap in the second graph too. So essentially, through closing the gap in the autistic difficulties, you also actually close the gap in autistic strengths. So the question he has is whether you think that might be a useful way to communicate to interventionists, for example, that they need to measure the potential downsides of them closing gaps on things people are, you know, struggling with, is that you might close gaps on things that they are good at or that are a strength as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I saw there were a couple of questions about that graph, so I apologise if that wasn't completely clear at what point I was trying to make. So this was actually a graph that I saw quite recently in a meeting, quite a big meeting, where we were, I won't go into the details, but where we were discussing a new project, a brilliant new project, which is focused around early intervention. The project itself is brilliant, but there was one slide which presented a graph like that. And the discussion was around that, you know, we want to create an early intervention because we want to close the gap. So this is the development of neurotypical children, this is the development of autistic children, and we want the development of autistic children to look more like neurotypical children. And I just wanted to highlight, because that is the kind of an example of a kind of discourse which does reflect the normalization agenda that I was talking about. And, you know, it's not that I'm saying the early intervention that was being talked about is not worthy, it absolutely is. But the reason that we want to intervene with the development of autistic children is not because we want that to be like the development of neurotypical children. It's because we want autistic children to learn, develop, communicate, reach their potential in exactly the same way that we want that for all children. And that is a worthy goal in and of itself. So I did struggle with that graph as a way of trying to articulate what we're trying to do with our intervention. And also, as the person asking the question points out, it's problematic because there are lots of different aspects of development, lots of different developmental domains, communication, language, visual, spatial skills, motor skills, and so on. And any one child can look very different on all those different domains. And also because, as the person rightly points out, the development of autistic children can sometimes be better, whatever you call better, but their development can be faster, for example. An example would be hyperlexia, where some autistic children learn to read really easily and really quickly. And that can be a really positive thing because it can give them access to information, it can support language development. And if we were trying to make that autistic child development look more like a neurotypical child, that would mean us trying to kind of dampen down in some way their reading skill, which would totally be going against, you know, what is probably a natural developmental trajectory for that child and will lead to better outcomes for that child. So yeah, I absolutely agree with the point that's been made. And, you know, by trying to normalize, we're doing lots of things that actually might be quite harmful or might be detriment to the development of autistic children.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I think that's a good place for us to finish up. So that leaves me just to say a massive thank you to all our speakers today, which has been an absolutely fascinating, thought-provoking talk, and a reminder to everyone in attendance, do go and have a read of their paper that this was based on. It's free and open to access for all, and the link is in the chat. Do join us for some of the rest of the sessions of the Autistica Festival this week. We've got another session coming up at 2 o'clock today that was mentioned in some of the talks earlier. So register for that now. And we also have another keynote at 10 o'clock on Friday morning by Will Mandy, which is about how we might change mental health services for autistic people. So thanks again for your attendance. Do join the conversation on Twitter and do join us for some of the rest of the sessions during the week. Thanks again for your attendance today, and thanks to all of the presenters for an excellent presentation.